Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, apologies, I'm a bit delayed. I had a bit of trouble accessing the meeting.
Okay, look, let's start then. Welcome to this North Canberra Community Council general meeting. My name is Jochen Zeil. I'm the current chair of the NCCC. And we have two guests today who have expressed an interest in getting to know what sort of issues the community is facing. And I'm really grateful to Tim Hollo, who approached us first, and then Elizabeth Lee to come and hear what we are concerned with. And I suggested to both of them that we do this in a way where I briefly introduce some of the issues, and then we'd be very interested in hearing what Tim and Elizabeth would have in terms of advice, how they think community organizations like ours should proceed with some of these issues. And so Tim has asked to have 5 minutes or so to introduce himself, and I also wanted to ask Elizabeth whether she wants to have a brief introduction to what her responsibilities are in the moment. Do you? So if
Sure, thank you.
Elizabeth, do you want to introduce yourself to the NCCC?
No worries. Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks for having me along. And I note also that my Assembly colleagues, Rebecca Vassarotti and also Peter Cain, are joining us as well. And hello to Tim and the executive. Thank you for inviting me along. It's always very important, of course, to get along to the Community Council meetings, because you really do have your ear on the ground on a lot of the local issues that impact so many of your members. And for me, whilst of course I've got the role of leader of the opposition, I'm first and foremost member for Kurrajong. And given that we have 5 elected members in Kurrajong, all 4 of them are ministers, and I'm the only non-minister or the non-executive member representing Kurrajong. I do think it's extremely important to be available for local constituents in that regard, because of course where there are times that people may be concerned about some decisions that are made by government, they do need a voice to be able to take some things up in the Assembly on their behalf as well. I know that the NCCC has been extremely active, as are most of the Kurrajong's community councils, and I know that there's a lot of work being done in relation to the local issues, including a lot of the planning concerns that have been raised, and I look forward to hearing more about those concerns and how I, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, can assist in getting some of the concerns raised and addressed. So thank you very much for having me along.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Tim.
Thanks very much, Jochen, and thanks everyone for having me. And I also acknowledge Elizabeth, Peter and Rebecca here tonight. And I also want to just briefly acknowledge that we are, of course, meeting here on stolen land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and still to come of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I asked Jochen for the opportunity to briefly introduce myself, really, because I'm probably not very known to many of you, and kind of put to you a bit of my political perspective, essentially, about democracy and the desperate need for really improving our systems of democracy, which goes to so much of what the NCCC and all of our various community organisations in Canberra do so much important work in. So I won't take long, because I really do want to spend most of this evening listening to your thoughts, your issues, and your ideas about how we can do democracy better in this city. So just by way of introduction, for those who don't know me at all, I'm a North Canberra resident for many years. I have 2 adolescent kids who've been through Lynham Primary High and one now at Dixon. I'm a musician and bushwalker and have spent really 20 years as a climate and environmental advocate and activist in various ways. And really in the last kind of 6, 7, 8 years of that, I found myself becoming more and more actively a democracy advocate and activist than I might have thought. I guess, like many, I grew up, not necessarily thinking that I would have to be spending much of my adulthood fighting for democratic rights, but there we are. Like with the environment, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, in a sense. And I have become increasingly passionate about the wonders of grassroots democracy, really. And through study and participation in all sorts of various ways, come to really understand a lot about how it's crucial to better outcomes. It's crucial to better decision making. And really, the more we come together to discuss issues from different perspectives, from different viewpoints, the better outcomes we're likely to get, which is why venues like NCCC are so crucially important. I come at this from a whole range of different experiences. I spent many years as an advocate on the outside of politics. I spent a number of years as a staffer for Christine Milne on the inside of politics. And I've been very, very heavily involved as a community advocate and activist in all sorts of ways, from being one of the founding members of the Lynham Community Association to a lot of work around the War Memorial development, advocacy around getting better consultation around the delivery drones idea, which has cropped up, setting up Buy Nothing groups, pushing back against the encroachment of advertising in the city and that kind of thing. So really, this is the approach that I'm really keen to bring to politics from my perspective. And that's why I wanted to come to talk to you folks, as well as many others, and put forward this idea that, for me, the really special role of an MP that I could bring is not just listening to the community and bringing those views forward, but being a facilitator in the community, because I'm really passionate about well-facilitated conversations that bring together people with different perspectives to see if we can find creative solutions. And I think that there's so much space for that. And it's really, we see when that happens, the quality of the decisions that we get. And the other thing that I'm really keen to discuss with you folks, either together tonight or separately afterwards, is the space for reform of some of the institutions that too often create barriers to that. In particular, as a federal candidate, I'm thinking about the NCA, which I think many of you will agree with me, often does not provide necessarily the kind of space for democratic decision-making that it should. So that's me, and really I'll hand over to discussion now. Thanks for having me.
Thanks heaps, Tim. So to kick it off, I just share my screen and then we can follow through. So can you see this screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I suggested that we walk through 4 issues that we in NCCC are busy with. And the first one is living infrastructure and the DV 369 and what really happens on the ground. And just to make this clear, these are aerial photographs of 1, 2, 3 new developments in North Watson. And the 4th one is an aerial photograph of the old Watson. Now, we have a lot of strategies on living infrastructure. We know that we need to take care of biodiversity. We need vegetation. We need penetrable ground. But this is what is happening. And much worse is that this is penetrating the old suburbs. The old suburbs are actually green suburbs. And what you see here, 5 examples from Hackett of new developments on the left and the old houses on the right. And you immediately see what the problem is. What is happening despite all these strategies is the degreening of the old suburbs. So what do we do? What this means is that the current regulations are completely inadequate to follow through with what we all know we need to do, and that is cooling the city. Your advice?
I'm happy to go first if you'd like, Joachim. Yeah, no, thank you for raising that concern. And unfortunately, you're not alone either in this, with as in the NCCC. The South residents have raised their concern about this as well. And as you mentioned, this seeming move toward degreening, and I think you've used that word really, really well, and it's really, really obvious when you look at the aerial pictures. And I've seen a very similar comparison in the inner south as well. But unfortunately, of course, with this current government's policy in terms of infill, that's what we are starting to see. And I do note that in the last term, the Greens member Caroline Lakuta did raise her concerns that the variation included a 15% canopy cover requirement in residential multi-unit infill, which of course falls very well short of the 30% target in the living infrastructure plan. And I really hope that the Greens, who have now a bigger presence in cabinet, will have some influence in relation to that. And that's what I would hope that we see. And of course, I mean, Rebecca's online as well if she'd like to pipe in, but it is something that we have seen raised. And I think that it's really, really important that this view get pushed up to the assembly level so that we can continue to make sure that the community's views that are very strong are very well known.
Elizabeth, just to jump in here a bit, what is driving this are very powerful forces. And these powerful forces are also the ones that will make it very difficult to get DV 369 through on the political level. That means that the plot ratio for green space and penetrable ground needs to be increased from 15 to 30%. So how do you suggest to tackle these very powerful forces that, for instance, the masters builders and development lobby groups that argue that if one would get a block ratio of 30% through, then that would limit the housing choices?
I think that housing choice is obviously very important, and Canberrans have spoken very loudly about that. And there are different ways, of course. I mean, because, as Tim said, we do live in a democracy, and we know that we have a lot of people who have different views about this. But it is about making sure that you do make this very loud and clear. And I think that the NCCC is doing a great job of doing that. And like I said, you're not alone in this as well. So I think that your voice is loud and clear. And we just need to make sure that there is the political will and the action at that level.
If I may make a couple of comments.
Yeah.
And thank you for raising this. It's an issue that I see myself. in the suburbs, and it's an issue I hear raised with me too. And I will ask Rebecca also to comment, because she obviously is right at the front end of this and knows what's going on. I understand that there is a lot of movement on shifting the regulations, but she can talk to that. In terms of your second point though, Jochen, I think you really hit the nail on the head in that there are very powerful forces that are trying to hold this kind of thing back, even though we know that most Canberrans want the 30% canopy cover. We know that most Canberrans want greener streets. We know that, of course, while housing choices are important and we all believe in the capacity of people to make choices, but we also all understand that in a democracy, our choices affect everybody else's choices and everybody else's lives. And we need to have democratic systems in place whereby we do limit personal choice for the benefit of the common good. That's really crucially important. And that's where democratic voices like this community council come in, but so many others. And I'm personally very excited by the kinds of things that, for instance, the Watson Community Association put together with their own neighbourhood plan of communities coming together and saying, hang on a second, this is what we've come together and worked this out. This is what we would like for our community as a whole. And development should be based on what the community wants, not what some company from outside, usually even from outside the city sometimes, comes in and says they want to do. And then we might have a flawed consultation process after the fact. So really getting community to drive what's going on in the streets, I think, is a crucially important point. But I think it's also important to hear from Rebecca with an update on what is going on in that space.
Just before we go to Rebecca, if she wants to say something, Tim and Elizabeth, it's also a battle for values.
Absolutely.
How come that people, a generation of people who have grown up in small houses, now suddenly are convinced that they need McMansions, that they need resort-style living, that they need huge houses? Where does that come from?
I mean, I don't know. That's it. Seems like a very philosophical question, Jakob. And it's well, I mean, what we've seen is, you know, when we talk about housing choice, is that for some people it's not actually a choice, and we can't forget that either. You know, for some people they do have limited means and resources, and so we need to make sure that we are being able to cater for everybody, because we do want to be a very inclusive and community that you know, we want to be making sure that everybody here in Canberra feels they belong and they've got a place here. So that is a really, really important part of creating the heart of our community, right? It's not just the bricks and mortar. It's about the people that live here that make this community what it is. But, you know, when we do need to be mindful of, you know, some of the issues that Tim's raised as well, that there is some responsibility at the decision-making table, and that is with the current government. And we need to look at what they're doing as well, that has resulted in a lot of the decisions that are being made that might not be, you know, to the community's liking.
Rebecca, do you want to say something to me?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I'm really happy. I don't want to co-opt the conversation by any stretch of the imagination. But look, I think these are really important conversations. I think that a really positive thing that there is an absolute commitment to the 30% canopy, and that's something that I did really want to sort of recognise the work that Cain, also another local representative who sends his apologies today, really sort of, you know, worked on with Caroline through the last assembly, but it really is the work of what we do to make that a reality. DV 369, I agree, is a really important piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, but it is a really important piece of the puzzle. There was all of the work that was done in the last assembly, and things have been pretty quiet publicly, but certainly we identify that as a really important piece of the puzzle. It ultimately does sit with the planning minister, but we have been very actively in conversations about the importance of that and working out exactly, you know, what we can achieve through that instrument. It may not be perfect, but, you know, I'm really confident that it will actually make a really significant, you know, it can really make a significant element. I think also, you know, like, I think, you know, we know that part of this is about planting more trees, and it is really exciting to see that we do have the commitment for 54,000 more trees that will be planted over this term that will really, you know, go towards it. I think there are a couple of other instruments that are important. In the Urban Forest Strategy, it does talk about the review of the Tree Protection Act, and I think this is a very important part of the picture, and something that we do need to look at in terms of what trees are covered within the Tree Protection Act, the fact that there is a real disincentive to remove trees, and that we can ensure that, you know, we're looking after the trees that we have. So I think that is important. And sort of when we sort of look towards greenfield developments, things such as the Residential Estate Development Code is something that I think we really need to look at. The other thing that I would just say, we also just need to ensure that we are monitoring what is going on, and I think the ongoing reporting through the LADAR data, and I understand that is coming out quite soon. We need to make sure that is as robust as possible to ensure that we are actually delivering. And so those aerial photos show a story of increasing canopy, not decreasing canopy. So that's a little update about where we're going to. Totally agree, 369 is important, and we're sort of really working to bring that to fruition.
Anybody else wants to chip in? Oh, they're all mute.
I might briefly make a comment on your point about the values shift, if I may, which I think is a crucial one. And it goes also to why I've been so actively working to keep public space advertising out of this city, because I think there is a shift. One of the reasons I think Canberra has been such an amazingly progressive city for so long is because we haven't had public space advertising. We haven't had billboards in this city. They're starting to creep in. And I'm not in any way suggesting there's a direct causal relationship between public space advertising and larger houses. I am saying that they are two parts of a very similar puzzle, I think, that which is kind of growing consumerism and that desire for more, which the very large houses do show. But I think what's really crucial as well is that can be enabled and facilitated by regulations, or it can be discouraged by regulations. And that's the really important thing with points like DV369 and the 30% permeability and 30% canopy cover, because if the regulations say you can't do it, and if they're properly policed and monitored and managed, then it does limit what people can do. And I think that's a beneficial thing. Like I said, we don't want to limit choice overly, but we do want to ensure that people's individual choice also takes into consideration and feeds into the common good.
Yeah. Which brings us maybe to the second range of topics. And I just share my screen here again. And that has to do, it feeds into something else, common goods. We have large major developments, especially along Northbourne Avenue, but anywhere else. You see these big multi-story blocks here along Northbourne Avenue. And these big developments do not contribute anything to the common goods. No. So if you look at a huge multi-story house there, you ask, where are the playgrounds? Where are the places for people to sit outside? Yeah. COVID-19 has shown how bloody important that is. What are the contributions of these huge developments to the common goods?
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Sure, Jeff.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm onto that issue, and I've got a submission at ACAT at the moment for the Lynham development, which would be about another 800 units on Northbourne. And like you just saw there with the Soho developments on Dixon, none of the traffic, none of the freighters or garbage is allowed to come from Northbourne. So it's all pushed onto the back streets. And the back streets were never designed to take that amount of traffic, nor the trucks, etc., nor the pollution and the noise, etc. It is an idea from the ACT government that no entry or entrances on Northbourne Avenue is just, there might be an idea, but it's just not practical. It'll never work. There's too much traffic being forced onto the back streets all the way along Northbourne Avenue.
So, I mean, what Jeff is saying, that it's not only do they not contribute to the common goods, but they destroy common goods.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't understand that.
These developments destroy common goods.
Oh, no, it's common bad.
So,
look,
the question here is, it should be possible in the planning system to demand that large developments have to contribute to the common goods, not only for the inhabitants or future inhabitants of these developments themselves, but also to the environment around them. And there are in other constituencies clear guidelines, like 15% of the value of a major development has to go into common goods.
Look, I'm not against the densification of Canberra and having people closer to the city, but it has to work. And so, for example, on that Northbourne Avenue, the slipways that are currently used at the hotels and other developments work well, where the cars slip off the lane and then into the building, and then they slip out of the lane. And that works very well. Common good, well, no one really likes to see the densification, but we can't avoid that. That's just going to happen, and it means people don't have to travel 10, 20 kilometres. I used to live out of Belconnen, and it was a long way to ride into town. Yeah, there's lights everywhere now and traffic restrictions. Anyway, you've heard my point.
I would back Jeff's point that infill is necessary, infill is happening. It's appropriate that it's happening. It needs to be done well, is the point. It can be done well and it can be done very badly. And I agree with you that sometimes it's not being done particularly well. And in terms of the common good, particularly with that development along Northbourne, which was part of the Gateway Plan that the NCA had a role in, I actually put a submission in myself to that process around the Gateway Plan development, in which I did argue very strongly that a proportion of those developments should be made into, for instance, accessible community spaces for community groups to hire out spaces, public space for play and for gathering, affordable housing, developments which the community can co-design rather than consistently developer-designed apartment buildings which aren't necessarily what people want to live in a lot of the time. And unfortunately, the NCA, as traditionally happens, kind of ignored a whole lot of the submissions and just went ahead with a Gateway Plan, which in many ways isn't awful, I think, but isn't as great as it could and should be. And a big gap there is ensuring that the development does actually contribute to the common good rather than, as you say, kind of subtracting from it as it too often does. But yeah, the crucial thing is infill is happening. It's going to happen. It's good that it's happening. We just need to do it well.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Carrie?
Yeah, there was a really good example of a cooperative development in O'Connor where there was a young university student from ANU, and I can't remember, I think it was Jenny something, and she convinced the developer to put some money into the wetlands because it would enhance the apartments they were building, and that was just beautiful.
Yeah.
Jochen, I'd like to say something too.
Marianne.
The common good, I can only fret about the loss of common good in relation to West Basin, which is to me a frightful situation. And I'd also say that the concessional leases for various sporting facilities in Canberra have indicated a loss of what I would call common good. that has gone to the Raiders and various other sporting, and no doubt will probably go to the golfing fraternity and various other issues of concessional leases, where common good, this concessional leasehold land, which was provided for community facility, the community facility is lost. It's valorized by going to the highest bidder and what they can do to turn it into a very big profit. And where does the common good go there? Because suddenly you end up with some, in many cases, gated communities.
Joachim, can I add a little bit? Thanks everyone for coming along, especially the MLAs, for giving up your time. I know you're extremely busy people, but I'd like to support Marion as well, is that one thing we are seeing is not only the doubling of the population along Northbourne Avenue, but it means that the people who are coming into that corridor will be borrowing the parks, community facilities, etc., that already exist on both sides of Northbourne Avenue. And unfortunately, I don't think I can support Tim in saying this is being done really well. It's actually being done pretty appallingly, because not only are we not planning for the demands of this much increased population, but we're also losing quite a few community facilities and green open space and sporting, land that's currently sporting and recreation, mainly pushed by the idea that sporting clubs are getting pretty close to being not viable. So their greatest solution to their non-viability is to build apartments on what was sporting and recreation land. And you see it with the Ainsley Bolo, you're seeing it with the racing club, you're seeing it with Luana Golf Club, you're seeing with quite a few of the community facility sites around Canberra being turned, especially in the inner north, being turned into social housing of different forms. So one thing I'm really worried about, and I think a lot of people in the inner north are worried about, is there's absolutely no planning for the needs of the doubling of the population for those sort of recreational community facilities, meeting rooms, etc. Rebecca might have a different idea on that there is some planning going on, but at the moment, it's pretty clear that we're losing quite a lot of green space to the infill, and it's just not working whatsoever. There's a lot of cars coming through the inner suburbs because they don't come down Northbourne Avenue, and the population is just increasing dramatically. So one thing I've been really disappointed in is the amount of strategic planning going forward. And it seems to me that the planning system just focuses on single blocks, canvasses all the issues around that single block, sees if it meets the planning legislation. And to be frank, if it's sort of close to the planning legislation or maybe a little bit outside, we give it approval. There's no thought whatsoever about the common good and what impact it's going to have on the rest of the suburb. I think all the MLAs know that the schools are under a lot of pressure in the inner north. Preschools, if you want a preschool spot, well, try Gungahlin or try Fishwick, because you certainly can't get a preschool spot in the inner north. So that's I'm really desperate for MLAs to say, well, how do we do a bit better planning, and ask our planning people to make some decent decisions and do a bit of strategic work, because it certainly isn't working for anyone at the moment.
Yeah.
Ian, thank you for that feedback, and it's something that we are hearing and have been hearing for a number of years, and I couldn't agree with you more that there needs to be a holistic approach to planning, and and I know that Tim mentioned the NCA, but let's not forget that there is a lot of decisions that are being made at the ACT government planning level that also do have a huge impact, and we need to look at that. In terms of the holistic approach, I think also Jeff mentioned about traffic, traffic considerations. We're talking about Northbourne, a major thoroughfare, and pushing cars out to the back streets is only going to increase the traffic in some streets that were not designed to carry so many cars. And not only that, but of course, schools, as you mentioned, is something that was raised with me so many times whenever I was at the Watson shops, in the lead up to the election. So many parents who were concerned because it wasn't just Majura, it wasn't just Watson, it wasn't just North Ainslie. We're talking about all the schools in the inner north, including Lyneham. And that's why I was really disappointed that there was no plan for any inner north school developments in this budget as well. So that is something that has been a huge issue that has been raised. But I think the crux of the issue here is to make sure that we look at it holistically. And part of that goes to, I think, what we'll get onto next, Malcolm, which is probably the planning review stuff. And I'll talk more on it then. But there is a huge amount of frustration with the planning system, and that leads to a lack of trust and confidence from the public, and that also leads to a breakdown in communication, and that's not a good thing for anyone.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Jochen, am I able just to make one comment? And I think it really does lead into that other conversation, the next conversation, in terms of, I think the real opportunity is around the planning review, and I think that there is shared frustration with how the system does work, and I think this is the real opportunity around looking at some planning at a district level. I think that is really, a chance that we do have to look at it not at a territory level and not at a block by block level, but actually be able to look at our where we live at a district level, and actually, like some of these conversations are difficult. We'll pick up on some of the things that Ian talked about around some of the social housing projects. I am a supporter of us looking at how we can provide social and affordable housing for residents. Everyone talks to me about their distress about the issues of housing affordability and homelessness, and we as a community, we do need to look at this issue and work out how we can respond to that at a suburb level. And so I think, I really hope that we can have that conversation in a way that says, when it makes sense and when it is appropriate, that we do look at slightly different uses of some of the land, but we also need to ensure that we do have appropriate green space and common good. And I really understand some of the frustrations in terms of how well or not some of that engagement is happening, and we are really working at how we can improve that. But I think it is an opportunity for us to look at that really differently.
It's just a comment on again, some tough issues here, and that is everybody in NCCC is fully behind you in terms of supportive housing and social housing and so on and so on. But what we are seeing is that the projects are being pushed into either community space, like in Dixon or in Rutherford Crescent, or far away from facilities. And the reason for that is that the development opportunities close to facilities bring a lot of money to the government.
Yeah.
I would though note that in things such as development, there, because of the work of the Greens, there are requirements to provide affordable housing as part of those developments. So there is some there are some mechanisms that are being used to try and support additional social and affordable housing, including through private development proposals. But I agree, Jochen, there's more to do. I absolutely not shying away from that.
One priority should be that they should be close to the facilities.
Yeah.
Jochen, can I raise a point?
Yeah, sure.
I think everyone agrees, Rebecca, that social housing and affordable housing's just fundamental to a society working successfully and building a community. I think one of the problems is that because it's some of the developments are pretty small, like the Rutherford Crescent one's 10 units. And I think when I look at Northbourne Avenue and I look at the fact that probably 5, 8, 12,000 additional units have been added to Northbourne Avenue. And I'm not sure whether the government has said to any of the developers, can we get more green space? And more importantly, we've got a policy for 15% affordable housing. Can you give us 10% of your 400, 500, 600 unit development as affordable accommodation? And that actually makes a difference. When you've put in 8,000 and it's 10%, you've got 800 new affordable units. Where in Ainslie, we're arguing over 10 units in a very constrained and bad site, and which the ACAT, of course, is supported. That's the issue. I think government has to be a bit more courageous and not, in a sense, leave or not try and put different policies or try and get different policy outcomes in something like Northbourne Avenue. Northbourne Avenue is, I don't know what that's worth, but it's probably a couple of $1 billion worth of estate development, and we haven't, as a community, as Joachim said, asked for enough community good to be given back. 10% is not a lot when you consider how much is being made off Northbourne Avenue. And when you consider how much the land, you know, which used to be public housing, as we all know, which has been given up for development now, I think we should ask for a bit more, and that would actually solve or go a long way to solving the affordable housing problem. Whereas when we pick off community facilities, green spaces, we're adding 10, 20, 30. It's not even resolving the number of new homeless people becoming homeless as the prices go up.
Yeah, look, I actually agree, Ian, and I think part of the problem with the Northbourne Avenue developments that they did actually fall within a period where there wasn't a contribution requirement. There now is. I think there are actually real opportunities down Northbourne Avenue, particularly with some of the build to rent proposals that are being looked at down the corridor. Look, you know, although
so you're saying they are actually going to be asked for a contribution?
Certainly, we're looking at affordable housing as part of those developments. Absolutely, build to rent needs to deliver the affordable housing outcome. The thing that I will say that when Common Ground comes online, that I know it doesn't sound like many houses in terms of the homelessness issues that we're dealing with, it's going to make a huge difference. It will help me sleep more at night. So, you know, even 5, 10, 20, 30 houses, in terms of particularly with rough sleeping, that sort of contribution will make a real difference and means that there will be people that will, you know, not need to sleep on the streets. So, you know, I just don't, you know, like I agree with your point, but I wouldn't underestimate every part of the contribution.
And what's going to happen to Ainslie Avenue, Rebecca? Because there's going to be common housing issues there, or certainly social housing. I look at Canangra Court, which should have a heritage citation on it, and I look at the other Jerilderie flats, etc. And I gather Purdon is doing some kind of big look at all of that, and I suspect it's going to go high rise and premium prices. And those people are going to be, who knows, they're probably going to go out to the outer suburbs of Canberra because I would hope they don't, but I would like to see the same sort of thing that you're espousing in Ainslie Avenue, but I doubt it will.
Yeah, look, I don't want to hijack. I feel a little bit like I've hijacked this conversation. So I'd be really happy to take that. I think it's actually worth a conversation, Marianne. I think it's a really important conversation. There, you know, it's not part of my portfolio, and there's no decisions that have been made. I can guarantee, you know, like the commitment that I make is that we need to ensure that the people that, you know, live along that corridor are continue to be supported in the communities that they now live. So if that, okay, is that an appropriate way to deal with that issue? Because it's a huge issue and we could spend a lot of time, but I'm really happy to take that on notice and we can have that as a discussion point at a different, you know, at a different meeting if that works.
Yeah, let's see. I have a hands up. Is Anne? Anne? You have your hand up. You want to say something? Anne's iPad.
I have my hand up, and Forrest. Is that who you're referring to, Joachim?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm from the inner south, and I just wanted to say, particularly to Rebecca, in reference to this new planning strategy that's underway, that it is my view and the view of many other people that the consultation, well, that's not the right word, that has occurred to this point in time has left everybody with no trust at all about what's going on, and who knows where this proposed new strategy is going to lead us. Just going back to the public housing question, which of course should be deeply embedded in any new strategies. 20 plus years ago, this city had legislation requiring developments, multi-unit developments, to include 10 to 15% of public housing in the new development. And that was lost during this Labor government's very long term.
Yeah.
And in the inner south, as you may or may not be aware, we have lost enormous sites of public housing, Stewart Flats, Red Hill, down Stewart Avenue, etc. All of it is gone, and we are becoming so gentrified, it's sickening. And we've no idea where all those people have gone. And there's not one skerrick of public housing coming back into those redevelopments. So look out inner north. Thanks, Joachim.
Thanks, Annie. Peter.
Yeah, and just quickly, and I agree, I think we're all agreed we could talk all night about these issues. But look, I certainly want to endorse much of the sentiment tonight, certainly about the consultation as part of the planning reform. I went to 6 of the 8 divisional.
We come to that. That's an extra point. Okay. We'll come to that in a moment.
But one thing that I think is worth keeping an eye on, Joachim and fellow council members, is that in the Assembly earlier this month, the Planning Minister introduced a bill to enable the ACT to buy land beyond its borders. And so that we don't have any detail on that. And that will be something that I think is worth exploring and keeping an eye on, because that surely should impact on its current commitments. And even though I suspect the first target will be the gin and dairy development in West Belconnen, which currently is planned for part of Yass City Council. But there's a lot that one could say, but I'll just leave it at that now.
Look, thanks for the discussion on this point. I just want to leave it now, but I want to throw a hot potato before we do. Years ago, I asked Niels Avery, he was the chief of ACTPLA, what the profit margin of Canberra developers is. And he said, probably 30%. That is double what I understand from others to be international standard. It would be worth having an investigation on the profit margins of developers in the ACT. That would free up a lot of money for social housing. So let's go to the next point. And that is the hot potato of compliance management. And I rush you through 3 examples because I want to discuss the general problem of compliance management in the ACT. The first is lack of compliance management of development applications. Members of the NCCC community spend significant amount of time and energy to assess and challenge non-compliant development applications. Example is the Coles Doma case in Dixon, the big developer that now is taken on by somebody else. An NCCC member documented 65 statutory breaches ranging across a suite of development codes, found 2 technical amendments where community facility land was rezoned without following proper process. The elevation grossly misrepresented the heights, and so on and so on and so on. This is just one example of many NCCC members are involved in. What that says is that the community does the job of the agency. Second example, compliance management of residential building regulations. Most building regulations, building process and building quality issues lack a complete oversight, and residents are largely left to their own devices. And the complaint avenues that exist are slow and often ineffective, partly because there's probably a lack of staffing. And one issue, for instance, are exempt developments. These are developments that are exempt from development applications. You can't lodge a complaint against them because they are private building certifiers who certify a development as exempt. The agency has no idea what's happening there, doesn't see plans, and residents have no ability to lodge a submission to that development. It's a tool to ease the load of assessing development applications to the agency, but it is not a tool that allows residents to shape their environment. And the third example is compliance management in protecting the conservation values of our nature reserves. COVID-19 has shown that people hugely, hugely appreciate these reserves. There has been a huge increase of people using them, and unfortunately also increased compliance issues, like these examples here of mountain bike paths being built with crude methods through nature reserve. And the agency, Parks and Conservation Service, has no way of controlling this. There is no education strategy, there is no compliance management strategy, and there is a huge biodiversity loss and conservation value loss. So the general issue I'd like to discuss is compliance management. We have rules and regulations in terms of DAs, in terms of building, in terms of conservation values of natural reserves, but there is no compliance management. Often there's also no education.
Thanks, Joachim. I think that that's a really, really good lot of examples, and they highlight just how difficult and challenging navigating our planning system is. As you say, when you make rules and regulations, the first thing to do is make sure that it's clear. But what we get in terms of feedback from both the community and the developers is about the uncertainty and the inconsistency and the lack of transparency about the rules. And so, as you've mentioned in your first example, that was extraordinary, where there were, over 60 statutory breaches that were found. And as you said, it places the burden and the onus on local residents. And, if in a situation where there are local residents who do not have the resources or the time or the know-how, then they just, suffer. And that's hugely fair and a big problem in that regard. So the lack of transparency and the lack of clarity around planning is a huge issue, which of course leads to non-compliance. And then I think what goes hand in hand with that is the lack of enforcement. So when you do have developers who breach and there is seemingly not much enforcement, then there's no disincentive to not, and that makes it really, really difficult. But you're right. I think that in terms of that outsourcing, if you like, of the policing of planning rules to the local community, it's something that is hugely problematic and needs to be looked at. And that's why this planning review sort of came with some high hopes. But my understanding is that it has been very, very lackluster, not only in terms of its consultation with the public, but also a lot of people who in good faith have gone along and given feedback, and then have been told basically we've got to start again, and that really doesn't give much confidence or trust to the people who have in good faith engaged with that process. So it is a huge issue.
I'd like to add to that. Recently, a friend of mine in Torrens Street in Braddon, development beside his house, he took it to ACAT. I went with him as a seconder, and there were directions given at that ACAT meeting. The builder ignored it, and after he built the building, asked for amendments which APRA approved, and the amendments were to override the ACAT directions. So,
there are lots of stories like that. I can also add to that, but the more general point, just to what Elizabeth was saying, at the moment, this planning review is at such a high level and state that for us, it is completely unclear where and how compliance and quality and regulation issues come into force, or where in the new philosophy of planning they would be accommodated. So we constantly feel it's too early to talk about such specific things, but the current system quite clearly lacks a compliance management strategy.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's and the response from government about all those concerns was to do the planning review, which in itself has raised its own problems. I suppose that was the point that I was making. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay.
Elizabeth, could I ask you a question? I just wonder about, from a legislation point of view, the whole issue of culpability seems to have gone west. Can you shed some light on that? Because it really fascinates me. I mean, we've just had a recent example of another Mr. Fluffy in Reed, in the heritage area. And where's the culpability in that? Basically, it would appear to have been hidden. But, you know, and I'm quite sure there's a whole heap of other issues here. When culpability and consequences can't be levied at owners or previous occupants, whatever, to me, there's no stick. And I'm afraid, yes, there's lots of carrots, but basically, to me, there seems to be no balance in the situation.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right. The difficulty with like planning legislation being so dense and difficult to read is that there is no certainty, and so there is no clarity or any transparency about what that stick might be, who actually bears the risk, who is responsible and who is accountable, and that makes it enormously difficult, and it does force residents to take legal action, and that's not only time consuming and costly, but also, as Joachim said, why is that being outsourced when it's actually not the role? And that's a hugely difficult thing, and that's why, you know, in a way, as much as it would have been really frustrating for the people who engage with the planning review to hear, you know, the planning directorate come out and say we basically have to start again, was enormously frustrating. In a way, kind of had no option, you know, because it is the way it is at the moment, and so this is where we are at the moment.
Joachim, can I make a couple of comments?
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that issue about when we get to the detail of some of the planning review, I think it's a really important one. Like, I also reflect on, again, the really important work that's happened through the last assembly around development applications and the inquiry that happened last year. You know, like, it would be absolutely my expectation that when we are looking at, you know, some of the the detail of the territory plan and looking at things such as DAs, that we really draw on the expertise and the work that has been done, that lots of community have contributed to, because if we do get the rules right, that need to, you know, use the ACAT mechanism, hopefully, you know, hopefully we can streamline that. I understand the frustration that people have, that it is sort of really looked at, you know, the ACAT has become sort of, you know, a key part of the process, really. I just wanted to also just pick up on the issue of compliance, and there are tools that sit outside the planning area, and that is some of the work that I am actually doing some work on in my building, sustainable building and construction portfolio. So sort of the key, you know, some of the key projects that we're working on, the first one is around engineer registration. So ensuring that we've got, you know, that professional class has got a registration process. Really talking to that issue of you know, of where the accountability lays. The idea of a building developer license or building developer, you know, registration or whatever that looks like. I think that really is trying to, you know, identify what role do property developers have, and how can we, you know, make that transparent and there be accountability. So we're working on that project. We're also looking at how we do have some public certification, so we can really break that sort of conflict between the relationship between builders and certifiers, and so we're sort of doing that work as well. There's a fourth one, there's a fourth major project which I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but there's actually quite a bit of work really trying to get to the nub of the issue in terms of this compliance. So it's absolutely something that we think that there are some big projects that we're working on that will take a little bit of time, but will really seek to address some of those, you know, some of those issues that I think are very fair concerns, and we think we have some ways that we can make it much better than it is right now.
Okay. Anybody else?
Joachim, it's Anne Forrest again. Before any of the MLAs and possible politicians that are sitting in on this meeting were involved, there was a lease compliance unit which was...
You're dropping out, Anne.
Reasonably active. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
There was a lease...
You're dropping out again.
It appears to have... Right, sorry. It was moved into Axambra and basically it disappeared. And most developments in suburbs, in RZ1 zones in particular, and in heritage areas, resident is deeply concerned about what's happening next door. They are exempt.
Dropped out.
You're dropping out again, Anne.
There is no...
Look, we can't hear you. Look, we need to we better move on.
Move on, yeah.
Sorry. Margaret, you want to say something?
Yes, just to Rebecca, thank you very much for telling us about the major projects you're doing in building quality. I'm just concerned about the timetable for that, because we already have a backlog of buildings that have building problems, and one of them is mine, which has a scaffolding at the entrance, and I couldn't even get into the building one day, so because of the scaffolding going up. So for us, we don't even know the reason why that's happening. No one's said, but we're just told it's defects and just wait and they'll be sorted, and that's good. But with your projects, I think they're really fundamental to the system. And given the numbers of building approvals that we've had just in the last month, I think, urban infill is going to happen, density is going to happen, that having some clear timetable around those projects would be really beneficial, both to the industry and to the consumer. Thanks.
Sure, Margaret. I can feed, what some of the timetables are on those projects and bring that back to North Canberra Community Council, sort of what the stages are. I really take your point. The challenge is some of these are actually quite significant projects that we're really sort of, we do need to take a bit of time to make them right. So we will absolutely deliver them within the term, but I do need to be honest that it will take a little bit of time for us to work out how to deliver it. Things such as building property developer, licenses or registrations. That hasn't been done anywhere else. So we are sort of really building a new model. So we do need to make sure we get it right. But I'm really happy to bring the timetable here. It's absolutely a priority of mine that we get these done because I think they will make a difference. But the other thing that I would just note that we do, we are sort of really looking at how we do bolster the resources of Access Canberra. I think, again, that's been a really fair point, and we have, as part of the budget that's just gone, actually provided additional funding for more compliance staff within Access Canberra. We've done some additional resourcing over a number of years, but we recognise that there needs to be more, and so that has happened, and that will see more work on the ground moving forward.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks for your contributions to this. And so I'm now moving to the last point. It's one that also is a very contentious issue. How do you consult properly? And one of the problems we face in NCCC is that because large developers have to consult somehow, we are becoming a sort of dumping ground for consultations that are then just ticked off. And what happens is, for instance, here in April, we had a meeting where JW Land delivered a briefing to us on their Bratton Place development. And they promised to send us copies of the presentation and of the assessment they've had of the design review panel. Since then, they stopped communicating. Nothing happened. And the other example is in the context of the planning review, we had an Inner North District planning workshop where many of us and people present now were at. And that was followed by a listening report, which I just have some examples down there, which a lot of people were really frustrated with, because it was a collection of motherhood statements that did not reflect at all the very detailed concerns and suggestions that were made in this one workshop. So we need to discuss, and maybe Tim has some ideas. We do realize that proper consultation is not an easy thing to do. It's not something done quickly, but it can be done in a way that creates confidence in people that they are actually involved and not only used as a sort of consultation cannon fodder that ends up in pretty brochures that do not reflect what people want.
I'd love to talk about that. I couldn't agree with you more, Jochen. The state of consultation broadly, it's most obvious, I think, to most of us in planning, but it really absolutely goes across the board in so much of our democratic system. And I think, there's been a whole lot of comments in the chat all along this evening's conversation about the impacts of money in politics, for instance, and bureaucratization and all sorts of things. My view is that what is happening far too much of the time at the moment, obviously in planning, but also in things like, climate policy at a federal level and defence policy and all sorts of things, is that you have somebody coming in with a proposal, puts it to government, government decides that they would like to do it, puts out a consultation, which is generally a very brief and not particularly effective one, and goes ahead with it. And we've all seen that happen time after time after time after time. I think we really need, as a democracy, to rethink our whole approach to this idea, and consultation as it currently exists is not fit for purpose. What we really need to see is, at a democratic level, the people coming forward with what they would like to see, asking government to work on those proposals and working with government on those proposals throughout, and having regular feedback so that we can see what's going on, so that the people see what government is doing and are able to constructively feed into that process repeatedly. Because it's got to be an iterative process on so many of these things, and planning is such an obvious example of that. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, I was really excited by the Watson neighbourhood plan, for instance. And I think that kind of approach is a radically different take on this whole kind of thing, that really communities should get to democratically set the expectations of their government, and then be in a position to hold government to account for delivering on that. It's absolutely crucial that you have repeated rounds of these conversations, rather than presentation come in, brief consultation, not much feedback on it, and it goes ahead. That's not a democratic approach, and it's really a mockery of the whole idea of consultation. I had a series of public meetings that I ran during the last federal election campaign on participatory democracy and how we can do it better. And I was really delighted with the kind of feedback that I got from the community about that. And the reason I mention that is because it really goes to one of the points that you're making, which is that what I heard so often from people in those meetings was that people want to understand that their voice is being heard and listened to, but they don't necessarily want to insist that their particular view is the one that wins all the time. But they want to understand that they're being heard, and crucial to that is feedback mechanisms. Absolutely crucial is that when you make a commitment that you will let people know what's going on, you do that, you follow up, you let people know, and you then explain what happened. And I think that's missing so much of the time. That is hugely, hugely resource intensive to do it well, but that frankly is the job of government, and it's crucial that we do that kind of thing. But I think we all need to understand that doing democracy well is resource intensive on government, but it's also resource intensive on us. And I guess, as a final reflection, I didn't want to really jump into that previous conversation because it's well out of my remit. But while I don't think it's appropriate that government outsources to the community too much of the time, I do think it's really important that we as community members take on our responsibility, that it's actually going to be a bit resource intensive on us to do this kind of thing well too. So it goes both ways.
Look, there's a good example actually in the planning. You talk about neighbourhood plans. There were a number of neighbourhood plans for the North Canberra suburbs, including Hackett. They completely disappeared. So I have a project for where we could collaborate, and I'll contact you after that meeting with that project here in North Canberra, where we could actually try to make this work.
I'd love to talk to you about it, because to me, one of the crucial things is that the community just starts to do these things. because that's where the leadership is. The community starts to do these things, and eventually government will find itself having to follow.
Yeah. Any other comments on the topic of consultation?
Yes,
Marianne.
Joachim, a trail of, or a litany of disastrous consultations: the War Memorial, West Basin, the tram, Mount Ainslie foothills, Lake Burley Griffin. And I'm going to raise the elephant in the room for my sins, which is population. We've never really been asked in Canberra, to my knowledge. Perhaps we voted on it, but it's obviously past my imagination or my consciousness, that we've actually okayed the fact that our population is going to be doubled. And then if it's going to double, where is the really, really clever integrated planning with real assessment based on intelligent analysis of what this is going to cost us? And please don't justify it by saying it's going to create lots more jobs. Lots more jobs means lots more people, bigger population, and lots of tar, glass, cement, and so it goes. To me, if we're really serious about climate change, we should be actually thinking about the cost of population. I will put a caveat in here that at the moment, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to be able to transport all the Hazaras in Afghanistan out here to safety. I'm not trying to be racist or anything at all like that, but I think if we're going to double our population in Canberra, where's the water coming from? How much is it really going to cost us in terms of the built environment? How is that going to be paid for? Obviously by rates. Where are they going to come from? Basically, to me, I don't think we've seen a really sound business case based on environmental reality that actually justifies this in any way, shape, or form. And it makes me despair for the future. I've made you all sit back and tell that woman to be quiet for a while.
Irene, you need to unmute yourself. We don't hear you. No, we don't hear you.
Is she? Can't hear. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, you probably need to put the speakers, your speaker tone up. No. Okay. Who else wants to say something?
Yeah, can I butt in while
Yeah.
sort of that to you? So I think the consultation discussion is a really, really important one, and we have heard for years now about the concerns the community has raised about the consultation now becoming a bit of a tick in the box exercise, and that shows an enormous lack of respect to people who have spent their time and energy and resources in giving genuine feedback in good faith on a project that impacts them, their family, and their community, and that's clearly obvious over the last couple of years of feedback that we're getting, particularly when it comes to planning. A couple of things that Tim raised that I just want to make sure that we look at this holistically. There are two, I think, issues with point being, let's get the initiation started from the community. The first is that if we do want to be truly inclusive, we need to be aware that for people who are well educated, speak good English, being able to initiate and bring ideas forward to government or representatives is probably okay. For those who are in a vulnerable category, whose English is a second language, those in a low socioeconomic or low education, it's difficult for them to get over that hurdle of accessing government services, let alone bringing ideas forward to government. So we need to be mindful of that. The second is also that obviously we elect local representatives into our government to be our voice, and that is something that we can't outsource, and which is why I'm glad that Tim said what he did at the end, that balance. But I just wanted to put those 2 points on the table, that we need to be mindful of that.
Thanks.
Can I just jump in quickly? I actually really agree with what Elizabeth has said. So we often have lots of agreements. So it's also, that's important to know. And look, I think that issue of respect is really important. And for me, it's about respect and relationship. That's certainly, you know, like when we've talked about the ideas about a community compact from an ACT Greens perspective, that's really where we're trying to get to. You know, I'm really happy to be very honest. I don't think we've landed that conversation with our partners in terms of what that actually means in practice and how we can bring that together. It's a conversation that we are really continuing. I think that we have a long way to go in relation to that. And I think I think again, this is why I really see, you know, the opportunity around that district planning conversation is it could be a real opportunity. I don't think we know exactly how we can actually get the most potential out of it, because my understanding is part of the challenge with some of the neighbourhood planning processes, they were really good consultation processes, they had good buy-in, people got really excited, and then there wasn't that next step of how we actually make it happen, how we can ensure that you know, there was high expectations set, and then not necessarily the, you know, the understanding about how it could be translated or the resources that would be needed to deliver it, or, you know, what it meant in practice. So, you know, I actually think that, you know, like you know, in that spirit of that relationship and how we get it together, I'm not sure that we've got all of the answers yet, but I think it's a conversation that I'm really keen to continue to have with North Canberra Community Council and other councils, because I think it's still a work in progress. You know, part of this is a work in process, because, as you know, we've all said, actually good engagement and relationship it does actually take time and resources from everyone's perspective.
That's what I just want to say to the resources. The most important thing is time and stamina. Things can take time, but they need a consistent long-term approach and a really sincere way of helping people to talk to each other. Okay, folks, anybody else wants to say something to the topic of Irene? You need to unmute yourself.
Oh, yes.
Yes, we solved that problem. Thank you. I just wanted...
Jeff, Irene is talking.
Sorry, I just wanted to support what Marianne said before. I'm the convener of Lake Burley Griffin Guardians and also live in the inner north. And I think the local politicians should be aware. I mean, this is one organisation or a couple of organisations I'm in, but they should be aware of the depth of frustration and anger amongst community groups about the sort of tokenism that's given to community consultations with groups like Burley Griffin Guardians and all the inner south, the inner north. There is enormous amount of unpaid time and effort that goes in by highly professional people in these groups to putting in submissions to government, and then we are not listened to. It's treated as a tick and flick. And on issues like West Basin and other developments, you're left where it's quite clear the majority of community submissions are opposed to certain developments, and yet they are completely ignored. So it leads to a deep sense amongst community groups that democracy, as it's currently structured within the ACT and more broadly nationally, is not working for the community. And in Canberra, we see it time and time again. There's massive disillusionment with the planning in the ACT. And I think most people feel that developers have a carte blanche in this territory to do what they like. And it leads to people like me feeling great sense of relief when I see that our Integrity Commission will have phone taps installed, that they'll be able to use phone taps. We have Auditor Generals that can do reports. They do them, they get ignored. And I think for politicians to say, oh, we want community groups to keep doing this. Well, why should community groups keep putting in this amount of time and effort and to get a zero response. And that applies to the Greens for me as much as any other party. I'm left wondering who on earth can vote for in the ACT. And I'm sure a lot of other members of community groups feel the same. There's a lack of trust in politicians that, yes, you'll pay lip service to consultation, but you don't take it on board and the structures aren't there. And it's just not good enough for the ACT. Thank you. Sorry, that's my comment on consultation. But I think you need to be aware of the level of frustration and anger that is out there. It's very real and it's justified. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene.
I completely agree with Irene. About 20 years ago, we did the Braddon Neighbourhood Plan. We all met regularly up at the old Ollins Hotel on can't think of the name of the street, Limestone. We did it over months in big groups. We finally finalised that. And because the government didn't sign off it and wouldn't sign off it, it had no standing in the community at all. So we all wasted our time. Correct, Irene?
Thanks, Chef. We are getting on with time. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
John.
Sorry, I'm John. Hi, I'm John. I'm a long-time North Camp resident, recently bought a house in Ainsley. I just was hoping to contribute on the consultation discussion. And just because we've just touched on anger, I just want to note, like, that we're talking about anger in community groups. Is one of the big sources of anger amongst people of my demographic and younger is just the utter impossibility of breaking into the housing market. So a lot of people talk about being angry about, new developments going up, but so many people of my demographic and people younger than me who feel like they're never going to be able to get into the housing market are really angry about this sort of stuff. And I feel like what Elizabeth said about consultation being really time consuming and difficult for people who, don't have English as first language, don't have huge amounts of time to commit, work long hours, work irregular hours. That really touched a nerve with me, because I think one of the questions I have for the politicians on this call is how consultation can actually take into account the views of those people who are just never going to have the time to participate in like a long North Canberra Community Council meeting like this, or put together complex submissions with lots of pictures and graphs and stuff that are actually going to convince planners. And secondly, I was just curious about something Tim Hollo raised about having like rounds and rounds and rounds of consultation. A real question for people is like, obviously we all want like really good development outcomes, and we really want those green spaces and everything. We don't want development to just get held up forever and ever as well, because people want to be able to buy houses, to be able to start families, to be able to be participants in this great community we have here in North Canberra. And I feel like the lack of housing and the extreme housing unaffordability issues in this area are just really a real downer for so many people that I know personally.
Thanks. John. Ernestine?
I think since I put my hand up, Irene and John have sort of covered a lot of what I was going to say, but as Jochen knows, this whole concept of pre-DA community consultation is one thing I feel very strongly about. And as Jochen pointed out, Braddon Place development is something that's within my remit, because I'm part of the Braddon Residents Group. And just for visibility, when there was community consultation, pre-DA community consultation, there was one evening where residents were allowed to make one phone call and we talked to a developer one-on-one, and that was it. That was considered pre-DA community consultation, which to me is not adequate and doesn't meet that definition at all.
Can I briefly jump in and respond to John's points, wary of time, and I will be brief. Thank you, John, and I completely agree, and I am very much not just sympathise but empathise with your points very, very much. I'm around about your generation and in very similar positions. What I meant by kind of iterative processes and rounds is not that every single development would have to go through that. Clearly not. I see kind of systemic development and negotiation and consultation as being that round and round process. And we will, like Rebecca was saying, you know, the point is we're never going to get it completely right because things will change, circumstances will change, and we'll have to revisit it. So yeah, we also need building affordable housing. We need to get on with things, but we need to do it as well as possible. And we need to start building in that process of good consultation and good participation.
Tim, the issues about consultations will apply equally, not just to the ACT government, but also to the NCA, which is Commonwealth.
1000%.
A lot of the anger that we feel as part of the community, you know, we have some amazing facilities in Canberra, and it just looks to me as though the NCA really don't have the slightest understanding of how to run a really good consultation process.
I would suggest that the NCA has not the slightest interest in running a good consultation process. The NCA basically sees its role as shepherding development, which is exactly what they did with the War Memorial, as you know, that I know. We got over 600 submissions and they ignored them all because they'd already decided that's what they wanted to do. And yes, that needs complete reform.
Just one, we need to wrap up because we need to follow this with an NCCC meeting. But I just want to make one last comment to John. Community means engagement in one way or other. If you want to shape your environment, you need to be engaged. And that takes time. I was chair of the NCCC and had a 50-hour job. So engagement is important. And one important thing about engagement is everybody according to their own abilities and not overpowered by what else one needs to do or should do or has to do or thinks one has to do. But engagement is hugely important for a community. Thanks, folks, for that discussion. That was really interesting. And I hope we can find ways of following it up. Not quite sure what advice we got, but I think it was a very good discussion. And I thank you very, very much for joining in and being so engaged with NCCC.
Thank you for the opportunity, really appreciate it. And if anyone has any local issues, please do feel free to contact my office as well anytime. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
And thanks from me to Jochen and everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity, and as well, my door is open. I'm always interested in hearing from people. Thank you.
You'll hear from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah, and thanks too for me. I feel like I sort of jumped in a fair bit, but the issue seemed relevant. So it's a great conversation.
That's really nice.
Well, look, it's part of the relationship. Yeah.
Thank you again. I'll start to head the drive home now, I think. So
you're welcome to join the boring NCCC meeting minutes stuff, you know. But,
if I was at home, I would.
You're allowed to go. It's okay.
Have an excellent boring meeting. Good night, folks.
So.